I guess I'll start by just sharing screen with you. I think let's do that. Share screen. And let me. Cool. All right. Thanks for joining me today. It was a wonderful opportunity to be able to do this. I have to say this is a little bit new to me because I've done obviously lots of talks where I can see a big crowd and I can see people nodding their heads or shaking their heads. So that's a bit of feedback. But in this case, I haven't got, can't really see anyone, maybe except like one or two of you, which is always interesting. So hopefully we can get through all in one piece. So tonight I'm going to share with you our story. In this case, how we built Studio Ninja from nothing, essentially, to 5,000 active subscribers, which is what it is today. A little bit about kind of our beginnings. And so myself, I'm trained as a UX designer, and I've been doing this since I've finished university. Obviously, it used to be called digital designer, web designer, and at some point it became UX designer. But the design thinking and design process has always been there. And the story started because I also own an agency called Yump. And I think it was in my 3rd year of running Yump that I met Chris, who's the other co-founder of Studio Ninja. And Chris is a wedding photographer and a very established one in Melbourne. But he's feeling a little bit burnt out. He was feeling a little bit burnt out because he's been shooting weddings for 10 years. He had been shooting something like 40 to 60 weddings a year. And he was coming across all the problems of being a really, really busy wedding photographer. And he had this idea in his head that perhaps something has to change about how a photography business is run. In fact, photographers don't even like the idea of the fact that they're running a business. They're just taking photos. Where did this whole idea of one needing to grow their business come from? And so that sparked that very first coffee that I had with Chris, where we were actually working out of the same co-work space, and we had known each other. But this particular coffee that we had was really interesting because he essentially put this idea out on the table, which didn't allow us to kind of, as I said, the rest is history. So the idea of Studio Ninja was born in that chat. Chris had actually done a bit of work on that before, which I'll show you kind of his way to kind of getting the idea out in the market before we even had a product, or we haven't built anything. So the idea here is that this will be an app that is built for photographers by photographers. It so happens that I have a photography background as well. So while I was being a UX designer, I decided that I wanted to go back to image making because I love photography. And when I did 4 years of that while still being a designer and really, really enjoyed photography, but I came to the realization that maybe I didn't really want to be a commercial photographer. But that passion for photography stuck around. And so when there was this idea that we could build a business app that helps photographers, and because we're photographers, we can design something that they really understand. So that's kind of where that comes from. In the wedding and portrait photography industry, some of you might know it well, some of you may not know anything about it. But as you know, with the ease of digital technology being available to everyone, it becomes really easy to turn your hobby into a professional career. So as a result of that, what Chris was experiencing and what we could see around the industry was that the competition was very fierce. And as a result of that, for some photographers, profit is low and business is hard. And often it's not because they are bad at photography, it's because they don't have a great system. So imagine spending all your time on pitching instead of spending all your time on pitching and marketing and hustling for more sales, you end up sort of wasting time on mundane tasks, such as following up leads, chasing up contracts, and unpaid invoices. Sorry, I just noticed a chat message. All good? Let's keep going. So our first pitch started in 2015. In fact, this is when we had a chat with Chris. In fact, Chris had was really inspired by a course that was run by a guy named Dane Maxwell, and I'll show you the link at the end of the presentation. But actually, he got rejected from the course. And so, so instead of entering the course, what he did was he read all the podcasts and all the blog articles. And essentially, the idea remained. The idea is that you can, if you can sell something before you build it, you have a business model. You can prove demand. And so what he did was he set up a WordPress website. He pitched the idea of Studio Ninja to a dozen Facebook groups. They're all photography groups. And there was an offer that if a photographer is willing to invest $150, that will secure a 50% off forever membership. And we had money back guarantee. And from that process, we had 70 signups. And that was essentially our way to prove that there is demand in what we have, and that the idea has legs, that it can potentially take off. So we sat down and got to work. We wanted to build it. We had a very aggressive timeline. We built it in 5 months. And we launched the very first version. You will call it MVP or beta, or you can call it terrible. It was launched in November 2015. The idea was that we were going to price it at $29.95 per month or $295 per year. And we had 600 people on the waiting list. So we had, in the meantime, collected a group of people who were interested to know when we're going to launch it, including our first 70 signups. And the day that it was launched, actually for the first 3 months that it was launched, there was 0 subscription. So imagine kind of going from this high, like, everything's going to be good and we're going to launch it. And then there was like silence. And so it was pretty much a disaster when we launched our first version. What I discovered was that it was easier convincing someone to pay $150 for a product that doesn't exist than to pay $30 for one that does. It's interesting, isn't it? Like if in a pitch, you can kind of create this imagination of what the product would be. But when people actually got to use the product, it was very difficult convincing them to pay $30 for it, because it didn't stack up to the expectation. So that was really taking, was a big lesson to learn. And the dreaded 4 words, I want a refund, right? I think when you're so angry that you're past the point of anger, that's what you just say. I just want a refund. That's it. End of sentence. And so that was the situation that we found ourselves in when we first launched the product. But we were determined to solve the problem. And so on the right here, I've got kind of a growth timeline. In fact, sort of what happened in the very first few months. We went from 0, and within kind of 3 months, we really kind of nutted out what the key issues. So there were lots of bugs. There were lots of just poor design decisions that were done in a hurry. Eventually, we managed to, convince a few more people, and you can see that there's a distinct change going from March 2016 to March 2017. So in 1 year, we started actually gaining some momentum. So what kind of happened in that time? One of the key things, obviously we did many things, but one of the key factors that looking back, I felt was for us a bit of a game changer, was creating a Facebook group for all our users, which then turns out that it almost consumed my life. I had this idea that, I was honestly really afraid to do it. I was like, I don't want to have all these people in a group and they can say everything they want to, and I have no way to moderate what they will say. And eventually that was exactly what happened. I was replying to messages and comments and feedback like every minute, you know, just like, oh, when I'm having a meal. In fact, I had just been replying a few customer messages just before I jumped on this webinar. So that practice actually has never left us. And in fact, we've embraced it completely. What started from a Facebook group was this kind of journey with our users where we wanted to involve them in every stage of our product development journey. And that means that doesn't matter whether the comment is great or good or angry or good or angry, let's say, or negative, we wanted to respond to every one of them. And so that's about responding to every comment, every feedback, every suggestion. What we were doing would seem to, for us, was I say a natural progression, but for people, it was bizarre that they could have this very open and transparent conversation with the founders of a product. We tried to involve them in lots of engaging things like polls, which is pretty simple to do. But you know, we'll also be careful saying not to make too many promises because product development is difficult. We try to have groups of one-on-one interview. So we would go on Facebook and say, hey, we're doing some user testing, who would like to put their hand up? And you know, this idea of offering incentive, like, oh, we'll, you know, give you $30 or $50 if you will help. You know, it never happened in our group. They're all so passionate. They wanted to jump on it as soon as we asked them. So we have a lot to thank. We have such a passionate group of customers who will be willing to give us their time whenever we ask. And often it's the case of saying, oh, actually, there's too many people here. I can only have 5 of you or 10 of you, or, you know, so it's a matter of kind of choosing who has time and who doesn't. We did prototype testing, which is pretty simple. We just have it on InVision and we take them through it. We ask a bunch of questions. We see how people react. We set them some tasks. We, if that goes well, eventually it will be on the test server. We would have some beta testing, and then we will launch it. We have try to keep the group very engaged with lots of updates, both good and bad. I think that's really a key thing for us. Is like bad updates. How are you supposed to tell someone bad news? We all hate the idea of giving someone else bad news. So how do we do that in a way that that makes it easy? Some people may have some questions about, you know, why do user research when you can just copy the best features out in the market and have an endless supply of suggestions from existing customers? One of the biggest challenge that we found with the Facebook group is the noise. As you can see, just so many comments and feedback and suggestions. How do you kind of go through all that and actually find a thing that it's really, really important? So we still do more detailed user research, whether that's interviews or testing or surveys, specific surveys, is to identify which features are most important to our highest value users. So in contrary, at the same time, we want to avoid working on features that don't actually matter much to our most important users. We have taken time to find out that, for example, Studio Ninja is best at the moment, is still kind of really most suited to a wedding or portrait photographer. But we also have celebrants, we have DJs, we have real estate photographers, commercial photographers. We have a whole range of users on our platform. And so they're all important, but who are the most important? And that's always a kind of an interesting exercise to try to kind of figure out. We also hope to, from some research, find a particular competitive advantage before competitors. That's probably the hardest one to do because that takes time and takes kind of observation, lots of observation, and sometimes it doesn't necessarily come from, say, talking to users. It might be, for us, it could be going to a trade show, standing in front of a trade show and just like talk to 100 people a day, and then kind of getting some insights from doing that. We like to have this idea that we can take it from ideas to features in these 10 orderly say, steps, and you probably be very familiar with these steps in your own work. So we want to kind of go from a big idea to a feature release. So we created this process that would take us from ideas. So that's also suggestions or observation or trends. And then we can massage that into kind of a wish list, which by that time it will be sitting in Jira. So we'll put it into Jira pretty quickly. We were doing some prioritization of that in terms of, what kind of makes sense and what doesn't. We would, from the prioritization, try to work out, okay, what does that mean for our roadmap? What does it mean for the next 12 months? And then we will go through design, testing, refinement, coding, and then testing and release, right? So those are all kind of pretty straightforward in that sense. But actually, there's so many of these steps that kind of overlap on top of each other. And sometimes we jump between steps. Sometimes you go to testing and you realize that, oh God, it's actually wrong. You go back into prioritization, or you might get to coding and you realize that you need to fix the design. So I like to, in fact, it's often more like that. So I think reality is more like organized chaos. And I think that's being, I would say, being very honest about how we like to think about ourselves as being very sort of orderly and processed driven. But in fact, it's actually kind of just, we're just trying to organize this state of chaos. Fast forward, since launching 4 years ago, we've helped 4 or 5 years ago, because we actually officially launched it in 2016. Yeah. So since launching 4 years ago, we've helped over 5,000 photographers around the world change their lives. So we started in Australia, and now we have 3 major markets, which is Australia, UK, and the US. Of course, the US has the biggest market. They have so many more people compared to Australia. And so what happened is that by kind of opening ourselves up to our customers and being very vulnerable and having all these conversations with them, I have to say I was a skeptic, but at the end I was a convert, in that the comments that we see coming back from people shows that they could see, they can see that we're really working really hard, motivated by making the best product. And they just, I love their language. It's great. Like I read these comments and it just brings a smile to our face that all the work that we've done is worth it. So I kind of like to kind of sum up with this beautiful quote from Haruki Murakami. I think it's one of my favorite authors. What happens when people open their hearts, they get better. So one of the key things that I felt was something that I was really afraid of, and that was something that I learned to embrace, was just being very, very open and transparent and telling people our flaws. Like COVID is a huge thing that has happened in the photography industry. What photographers have to stop working. They have literally no income at the moment. And so because photographers are hit hard, we are also hit hard. And we from day one have chosen to be honest with everyone that we're the same boat. We've had to think about letting go of staff, having very difficult conversations with people, and seeing our team change. But we have to do what we have to do in order to get through this. So just to kind of quickly sum up, I know I'm sort of pressing on time. How are we doing on time?
Take your time, Yuan. You're absolutely fine. Go ahead.
Awesome. Thank you.
No worries.
So we have I kind of want to sum up into like 3 main things that I felt that we learned. First of all, it's a marathon, not a sprint. Building a business from scratch, or building a product from scratch, is a long journey. We've seen people we've learned from other people when you've kind of done this, like when people may have pinned their hopes on a massive campaign, or people say, oh, you'll hit this point and you'll be exponential. Like people are always talking about this big thing that's going to happen, but that big thing never happened to us. For us, it's always been a slow and steady growth. It's about this thing being a marathon. So rather than kind of starting and stopping. We're always just trying to improve bit by bit, day by day, and we're in for the long haul. You don't, and that kind of leans in nicely into the second point that I wanted to make, is that you don't need to be the first. You just have to react to change quicker than everyone else. When we came on to the business app or CRM client scene for photographers, there are already other products in the market, which means that we were never the first anyway. But we found a way to do it better than most of them, so that we can earn the trust of our customers and then be able to grow from there. And the longer we're in this, the longer we realize that, you know, there's always going to be intense competition. Once people realize what you're doing, you know, then other people jump in and try to do the same thing. And so this constant need to change, and the industry is changing very quickly. Like when COVID hits, we needed to know what that means for our next 12 months. So how do we react quickly to that change to survive, essentially? So I think the ability to react to change quickly is really important, not just from a business point of view, but also from a product point of view. So keeping our eyes and ears open at all times, you know, reading widely, meeting lots of people, listening to our customers constantly is a really important part of being able to react to change. The last point is interesting because change is disruptive to customers. So despite the fact that we can see what's coming, and we're saying, okay, no, let's do this. Let's now have, you know, let's change our strategy, or let's start to improve that. Our customers who are potentially, you know, who are our loyal customers who love our product, you know, isn't in the same headspace as us. So it's really important that if we want them to change with us, we have to bring them along our journey. So it's about communicating, educating them why change is required. Or maybe we can see something happening with the rest of the industry. We say, okay, actually photographers have to change because that change is coming. So how do we bring them along that journey so that it's less disruptive to them? You know, we all hate that, for example, we're so used to using a particular app a particular way, and then tomorrow you came in and everything is different. You're gonna freak out. So this is how do we kind of smooth out that transition? And with that, I just want to finish a few more things before I say thank you. Just some further reading that might be of interest to you. First, one book that we love, actually, it's kind of a bit of a Bible around customer service is Delivering Happiness by Tony Hsieh. So Tony Hsieh is the founder of Zappos. And Zappos has a beautiful, interesting story about how they became sort of so focused on delivering customer happiness. And so that book is great in terms of like our philosophy to engaging with customers. Just Enough Research it's a little bit like my Bible to doing lean UX. Honestly, I'm not a voracious consumer. I don't read all the books and all the podcasts out there, but I do have a few things that I really, really enjoy, I really kind of rely on. And Just Enough Research is one of them. I think the second edition just came out. The first edition was done in about 7 or 8 years ago now. And they just had an update last year. And finally, the course that I started out talking about that Chris had tried to get in but got rejected from is called The Foundation, Start a Software Business by Dave Maxwell. So it's not a book, but it's a website. If you jump on it, there's lots of resources. And with that, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Yuan. That was fantastic. And there's loads of questions here from our audience tonight. So let's see. I'm just scrolling up to find the first one. Let me see.
How can I see those messages too?
If you open the chat there, the first one's from Sia, and she says, what was your biggest challenge expanding your market from AU to the US? So from Australia to the US.
Mm-hmm. So It's an interesting point when we first started, because we were a .com business. In fact, it's .co, so it's not really .com, but same idea. People will found us even though we were not within. So it was interesting that we had a product that was designed to be accessible from anywhere. You can just jump on, sign up for a trial, and start using it. Even though everything on our website says AUD, 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 people didn't seem to care. They just jumped on and started using it. And so we started getting people from the US and the UK signing up for Studio Ninja, even though we were not intentionally marketing to them. So that made us realize, oh, maybe there is demand there. But in order to actually enter the market properly, we still had to be pretty, I say, intentional with our effort. What happened was you could, for example, we started doing some advertising, Facebook marketing, or the usual, but that's really a small, play a very small part in entering those markets. What we found out was that photographers have we call it influencers or hero photographers. They are the people that they look up to. And in each country, there is someone that you look up to, right? And we found that in the UK, so it started with the UK first. So I think because of the similar taxation system between Australia and UK, and because we have a software that helps people invoice, the way that it's designed was really easy for people in the UK to kind of get it. They're like, okay, yeah, taxation works very similar. It's kind of like Australia, so they found it really easy to use the software. Whereas it was much harder for the Americans because the format is wrong, everything is not quite right. The dates are formatted wrongly. We use S's instead of Z's.
Oh yeah.
So it was interesting in that entering the UK market was quite easy, I have to say. Once we kind of was able to secure a few, say, famous photographers that loved our product, and then they say, okay, I'm happy to be kind of your face. I want to tell the world about you. It just became really easy. We had a lot more trouble with the US, like I said, with all the formatting issue. So we had to adapt the product quite significantly. We had to change quite a few number of different things, and to make it more sort of seem more familiar to the US market. It's still not quite there. Like I think it's like 95% there, but people still say, oh, I don't know. There's still something. There's always something a little bit that's a little bit off for Americans. But probably the biggest thing that we did to enter US market was we went there to exhibit. So 2 years ago we went to Vegas to set up a trade show. To participate in the trade show for one of the biggest photographers expos in the world. And when we got there, people were like, "Where did you come from? How come I don't even know you?" It's like, "Oh, well, I'm from Australia." They're like, "Oh my God, you're from Australia!" And so so I said entering the US market requires quite a significant effort, and we've done that through different ways, like with influencers, with being there physically in the trade show, and then all the rest online.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, sounds like you had some good times in America. You ended up going to Las Vegas.
Yeah. That's where the show is. That's where the expo is,
Yeah,
and it's a fun city. Yeah.
Good stuff. A few more questions here. Let's see. We've got Tim Campbell. He's saying, what was the key change you made to take the product from a handful of users to 700 plus in a year?
There's kind of two sides. You kind of got the marketing side, and you've also got the product side. I say from the product side, it was so for us that early on, that very first product was it was just filled with holes, and not just bugs and issues, but design holes, which we fortunately kind of plugged really quickly. So I think having a Facebook group was, like I said, one of the key things in that it allowed us to have this really open conversation with the customers, and actually them forgiving us. What happened was that they started to forgive us for having for lack of a better word, for having a shitty product. It was an interesting experience that we built this relationship with them that where it's like it got to a point where it's like, oh, it's okay if you didn't have that feature, but I really like you guys. And so it was this relationship that we have with our customers, which we are so grateful for, where we're able to say, hey, that thing that you think it's a deal breaker, like if you don't have that feature, you would never use a product. We really also want to do that, but we're a really small team. It's going to take us a while to get there, and we hope you have some patience with us, and we're going to get there. And then the magical things happen. People are like, oh, okay, I understand. I really want to support you. So it was that certainly that communication with the customers is really, really important. Exactly in terms of like what feature kind of made a big difference. There are things like we went through this I can't remember whether it was the first year or second year. We went through this whole thing of knowing how to do the refer a friend. So this idea that refer a friend is, people are like, oh, how do you kind of do it? But the way that has worked for us for refer a friend is making sure that both the referral and the referee get something out of it. So it's not one-sided. So if let's say if I refer a friend, we both get $5 off, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So that has worked for us better than the other models.
It really sounds like your customer relationships really built on getting more clients all the time, and you really worked on that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it never stops.
Yeah.
Like I said, still replying to customers just before I join a webinar. So it's like learning to be not just a good designer, but a good manager, a good team leader, but also a good customer service person. Like I think that's important. When you're kind of a small team, like obviously if you work for like a massive company, there are people who just do that. But the way that we run our business is very lean, and we really enjoy it. I think at the moment we have a team of 6 developers, a project manager, 4 customer service. Yeah, it's about 15 of us.
Right.
So it's a nice size.
So a lot of you wear multiple hats, do you? Like it sounds like you do a lot. It sounds like you do a bit of marketing, bit of design.
I like if there was one thing that my vertical is, it's product, right?
Yeah.
So I run the stand-ups with my team to make sure that the features are getting out at the right time, advising them on the way the product should be designed. And I'm still pretty hands-on, so I still do some of the design myself, but I try not to do as much of that these days. And yeah, just being really across all of the product side of the business, whereas Chris is more across the customer service and marketing. So what I try to do for his side of the team is being there as like a soundboard. Just contributing good ideas, being a good just giving them good feedback essentially.
Okay. Well, that was fantastic, Yuan. We might leave it there, even though there's still loads of questions, but I'm just conscious of time, so I might move on to Thomas. But thank you so much for presenting. Really appreciate it. That was fantastic.
Okay. Thank you.
I will post out your...
I will just stop share that, yeah.
Oh yeah, sure. I'll post out your prize from Whisper as well, from our sponsors, just as a thank you.
Okay, no problem. Thank you.
Right, before we move on, I'm just going to introduce Thomas. He's our second speaker of the evening. He has extensive experience in digital agencies, enterprise startups and consulting. He consulted in fintech, education. He's an SME in delivery, UX, product and management and organizational design. Thomas's time in tech has taken him to the UK, Southeast Asia, as well as Australia. His last role was as global head of product for a company called iflix. iflix served 20 million monthly active users across 34 countries, delivering movies, series, news, and live entertainment across 6 platforms. The teams Thomas managed were distributed across Cape Town, Prague, Beijing, Kuala Lumpur, and Melbourne. So that's enough for me. I'll hand you over to Thomas now, who's going to tell us about his journey working at iflix. So let me just unmute you there. 2 seconds, Thomas, where are you? Unmute. Is it working? There we go. Thomas, can you hear me?
Good. Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, great stuff. So over to you.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me, and thanks to Yuan for the previous presentation. That was fascinating, and I think Claudia picked a good bookend in terms of speakers with the different types of experiences that we've had more recently. iflix, which has been my most recent experience, is it's called itself a startup, and it was about a 5-year-old company, but it was serving the mass market in Southeast Asia. And I wanted to talk about my time there, which was nearly 2 years, within the lens of UX and what we did there specifically on UX, to turn iflix more towards the customer, and that's the title of this presentation. You, I think, can be forgiven for thinking that some of these larger companies that operate in the millions of users have concrete, ironclad, bulletproof processes and methodologies, and have hundreds of designers, but that's not often the truth. Rarely is that the truth. So I wanted to give a bit of an insight into that, and the bit of the dysfunction that iflix had and how we looked to solve it. And a shout out to a couple of people who are in this chat. Ivana, who I interviewed for iflix, and sadly she went elsewhere. You got Yuan Wang and Mark Thorpe, who are both in the trenches with me in the design team. So thanks for coming in and having a listen. I had to tone back my talk a little bit because you guys were coming, so I won't be as brutal. All righty, so let's start with what is iflix. It is now a hyper-local streaming service for Southeast Asia, 20-somethings, millennials. Hyper-local means that it serves content that is starring local people, it's directed by local talent, it's produced locally, and that's a far cry from where iflix started. It's also Southeast Asian focused. It's serving around 20 million plus monthly active users. And just to spend 10 seconds on that, a monthly active user is a common metric in product development, and it typically the common definition is someone who touches a part of your product or service within a month. So if you visit a product every day, you're only counted as the one user within a rolling window of time. It has original content, a bit like Netflix originals, Stan originals. More and more studios and streaming services are doing this, and local content. It is freemium, so you can come in and watch for free, no registration, no logins, or you can pay and experience a more quality version of iflix, no ads, more features. There is an ad-supported tier, which in of itself doesn't sound like much, but was a hell of a lot of work for us to do. And it's on 6 platforms, as mentioned. But what was iflix? Well, it started out being, in my view, a cheap Netflix with bad performance and a smaller library. It was in 34 countries, as Claudia mentioned, but we over the 2-year period I was there, we withdrew from 34 countries to roughly 10. And I'll get into that in a little bit. When I started, it was about 5.5 million monthly active users and was primarily Western content. So there was an enormous Western bias in the content that it was delivering. It was took the approach that Netflix is going to be huge. Let's just take the same content, put it in Asia, and don't charge as much. The original experience was heavily walled, a lot of friction. So there was registrations that were prevented you from even understanding what the service was and where the value was. So the assumption there was that you would know what iflix was, and you would already know that you wanted to be a customer. And that's how they designed the experience, which we addressed fairly heavily. There was no free tier. There was also on 6 platforms. So the reason I underline that is that all the change I'm talking about in this talk is change that we needed to make on 6 platforms. And those platforms were, you have iOS and Android, you had web, and as a sub platform, you had a progressive web app. We had Android TV, we had smart TVs, set-top boxes as well. So there was a lot of different experiences that we needed to consider. We'd think about a great experience that we could introduce, but we'd also need to think about how does that work with a remote? How does that work on a desktop? How does that work on an app, on your phone? And also considering we were targeting Southeast Asia, which are emerging markets, we had infrastructure problems within those cities and communities. That would mean data was a huge bottleneck. In addition to the devices themselves, often dealing with 10-year-old, 15-year-old jailbroken Samsung phones that were operating on 2G, 3G networks with spotty reception. So oftentimes they'd have maybe 50 to 100 megabytes worth of free space on their phone that they would uninstall, reinstall apps and play musical chairs with their apps. So there was some really physical, external to the app challenges that we needed to try and solve. So how I thought I'd frame this is in a bit of a before and after with issues that were faced with iflix early on, and how myself and the teams solved them. I'm not going to go too much into the product itself or the delivery too much. There's a lot to unpack, so I'm just trying to keep it within the UX lens. But I'm more than happy to answer questions outside of design. So before, there was no real customer research or insight. When I started, I was asking, where's your database of insights? Where's your research library? Where is the templates for your surveys, for your questionnaires, for your diary studies, blah, blah, blah. All the common tools that you might not use all of, but you would have encountered at some point within your experience as a designer. I started out studying industrial design back at university, and that was all about how humans interact with physical products. So there was always a lot of, body studies with this thing that you have designed. How does it work within the hand? Physical models. So to move into then UX design and eventually product, I've had some good experience in different methods, and I had hoped that there would be some library or evidence, but there really wasn't. And we moved from that deficit towards having a more thorough ecosystem of customer insights and testing, and that sort of inbound channel of information that helps steer us make the right product decisions. And I'll go into that in a little more detail, but essentially we came out of a mindset of blue sky thinking. The app, the product itself was stood up very quickly. It started out as an iframe within an app. So it was essentially a hacked together website in an app shell that was communicating to physical server racks that the original iflix techies went out and installed in the Middle East, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa, etc. So it was a very strapped together, early version, and the business has moved so quickly. It was a company filled with people who were doers and a lot of passion and a lot of energy, but there was a bias towards action and not enough thought about, are we doing the right thing? Are we building a strong foundation? And are we removing some of the debt as we develop this enormous product over time? And so within those, when I say we built out this ecosystem of channels, it took time, and we went from having very few, we had some app reviews coming through, one or two tools that helped aggregate, but we weren't really looking at them. We knew that we had a customer support channel answering thousands of social media comments and calls a day, but we weren't bringing them all together and trying to triangulate an insight or some real value that would uncover an opportunity, for example. So we had to get those talking, so we weren't looking through a single lens at a problem. We would see patterns of behavior across all of these different channels individually, but when they started to coalesce into a single pattern, or that would all elevate at the same time. You'd have app reviews that were negative about a single topic, and you had customer support channels through social media and the phone and the emails about a single problem. And then we also had a WhatsApp channel that we would talk to our users through, but they were a very small segment of our users. We would then look at the product itself through the quantitative data, and we would then say, okay, there's now a real problem here, and we would be able to troubleshoot that much more effectively. And then through those channels, we'd also be able to find patterns that we'd then be able to leverage into an insight that would lead on to a potential feature change or a whole new experience shift. But one of the things we did in regards, we didn't have any product or user testing. It was mainly done within the designers. Hey, what do you think of this? Do you think this is any good? So we went through a fairly thorough process to identify our tooling ecosystem. And one of the deficits we had was user testing. And in the past, I've used usertesting.com and in-person video recording. But one of the challenges that we had at iflix, and one of the challenges that really drew me to iflix, was we were located in Melbourne. Headquarters was in Malaysia, and we had product and development in Prague, and we had product and development in China, and product and development in Cape Town. But the core, I suppose, product development of the customer experience was in Melbourne, and therefore we were having to speak for and advocate for users that we didn't have access to. We couldn't walk out on the street and do a tree jack survey or a quick little guerrilla user test on a particular feature. So we had to find a way to have I suppose a thorough and robust and scalable approach to remote user testing. And so we went with a tool called Lookback, which was amazing. We also then, because we were constrained with people, we didn't have a huge design team. I think the biggest it got to was about 6 or 7. We also needed to engage third parties to do some market and customer research for us, to do a bit of that heavy lifting, and to go out and do that, get feet on the streets and go and speak to people and tap into their resources to help us. And then we also had a fairly large data debt to pay. We didn't have any real insight into the product itself, how it was behaving. And so we were able to retool and implement some really amazing real-time data analytics or product analytics that allowed us to also run experiments, do multivariate and A/B tests continually, and gain insight from that as well. So, and another before and after here was we didn't have a design system, and a design system in of itself isn't going to make and break. A lot of these things don't necessarily make or break a business when it's either at the start or you know, when it's growing. Customer insights, maybe arguably that's one, but design system, I've worked in plenty of companies that don't have design systems, and I'm a huge advocate for it. And that's because when you start to become more fluent in UX and product design, the IP just balloons. There's so much that grows, and it grows so quickly that if you have just folders, you know, on Dropbox, Google, local, it's all over the place, and don't have any version control, and you don't, you know, you've got one designer running the latest version, then you've got another designer who's running 2 versions earlier, but is doing a new design that we all really like and has spent 3 weeks doing it. You run into this patchwork of problems and challenges, and it becomes a very leaky system. So we spent a lot of time to understand what we needed. We were a remote team. We had stakeholders in KL. We were serving an enormous amount of users who were watching a lot of content and had a lot of things to say about it. You know, every day I'd wake up to about 2,000 new reviews on Android and about 400 on iOS. So there's a lot of manual just reading. What are people saying? What are people saying? And we needed ways to bring that all together and then have a thorough, strong foundation for design that would be able to bring in more people, so we could design, have comments, do live walkthroughs, do simple prototyping, and also for the design itself to link into development much easier. So it wasn't, to take an extreme example, Photoshop files. But we also were running design a little bit like an agency, which I'll go into in a little bit more detail in a bit. We didn't have any design artifacts. So when I came in and I wanted to understand where we're at in terms of the information architecture or the core journeys, or even just maps for me to orientate myself, I'm a very visual person. There wasn't anything. So I spent a lot of time just playing with the apps, which is, of course, is crucial. But there was no living, breathing documentation to lay out what we are at this point in time. And when you don't have those artifacts, it's easy to forget some of the bigger issues that users face every day. And also to forget the dead ends, the mismatch in typeface, the padding errors on, you know, these obscure parts of the app that you don't visit. So these were really beneficial, and I can't speak more highly of their value, and something that I would bring into meetings and pitches to you know, the CEO and CTO around things that we wanted to do, and just it helped me paint pictures, and also was a reference. So instead of having to get the phone and dive through, log out, then sign back in with a particular account to then experience what a paid user would look like, I could just go to a particular user flow and find what I was looking for. And that was really, really beneficial. Also, when you have 6 platforms, it was a painstaking job, and something that Sean and Thorpe did not enjoy doing, but I appreciated them doing it. Design and dev were not coordinating, and in my experience across the board, consulting and working client side, it's absolutely been a bit of a common theme. And it was happening at iflix. They were sitting next to each other. They were co-located, but there wasn't a sufficient amount of communication. And that was something that was solved very early. It was one of the first things, just get everyone looking to the left and right of them, see what they're doing. And also moving away from that designing in a vacuum. You know, UX teams are often spun up, and they're often spun up in a silo. You've heard a lot of banks that have labs. Those labs come out of a model that does not involve any technical involvement until at the end. And then you're asking engineers, developers to estimate on something they've never seen before. So I wanted to avoid that. Also, from a cultural and a morale perspective, involving developers and engineers early on is always beneficial. Some really great ideas we had were not from design, they came out of engineering. They understand the product and think about the product in a different way. And so that was enormously beneficial. And then the visualization of planning, which sort of moves on from that, is that if you're not talking to one another and you don't have any way of communicating what your plan is, then there's an enormous amount of waste. And we were moving incredibly quickly. We looked in terms of our product roadmap. We had 3-month rolling horizons. And so we were trying to have some level of certainty in terms of what product increment we would reach within that 3-month period. But we were releasing every 2 weeks. On our 2 primary platforms, being iOS and Android. So we needed to be tighter with our planning and our communication. So we had those macro planning boards, and a lot of this stuff might be completely basic and revisionist to those who are listening, but it's often missed. And it's just some of the basics of visualizing your work and communicating and having those opportunities to discuss and challenge one another on what is the plan and what is the most valuable thing. And even if being, you know, the position I wanted my ideas to be challenged as well. I didn't always like it, but it certainly was important that people felt they had that forum to challenge. And it often led to some better outcomes. And oftentimes I was wrong. No rituals or ceremonies, that's another thing, is when you're moving so fast and there's so much pressure, because the streaming industry is incredibly young. If you think about streaming as a whole industry, compared to the automotive industry or something like that, it's infantile. It's in its infancy, I should say. So no one really knows what they were doing, and it's hyper competitive. And being hyper competitive, companies are trying to figure out how to monetize sustainably, and are trying to one up their competitors with something that's different, that's shinier, that's grabbier. And it's easy for ceremonies to give way. I don't want to listen to what, you know, Samantha and John are doing for 10 minutes. I've got stuff to do. And we definitely had a bit of that bleed into iflix, and we needed to bring that back. Beyond that was also other ceremonies like Q&As, because I did find that I was a bottleneck, and I needed information to be pulled from me as opposed to knowing what I had to tell everyone. Like most startups, you're juggling, you're spinning plates, you're wearing multiple hats, and you always need more help and more time. So just making a bit of time to allow for curiosity and for discussions about what we're doing and why we're doing it were really, really important. And that eventually led to the teams feeling more aligned with the mission and the why we were doing things. And the tighter they were connected to the why, then it allowed them to be more self-directed and know that they were going to do something which was not going to get thrown out because it was so disconnected from the strategy. And that was really, really valuable. So I mentioned earlier that design was functioning somewhat like an agency, and that's a fairly defensive design structure where it came about organically, where the design team was small. It was Thorpe, who's on this call, and a handful of others, and they were the sole design team for a company of, I think at one point it was about 1,200, globally distributed, and trying to do a million things at once. They were trying to pitch to Disney to get, all huge swags of content. This is before Disney Plus. And there's a rumor going around that Disney Plus stole Thorpe's design, which is something I'll leave for another time. But we had pitch decks to marketing, which was a completely disconnected part of the business that was coming and needing advertising for XYZ promos. So we didn't want to say no. We needed to serve and to collaborate, I suppose, collectively as a business. But to do product development work is a very different mindset to doing agency kind of. We need an A3 poster for this promotion we're doing at an Asian expo on streaming in March. They're very different things. So we needed a setup that was a little bit flexible in that result, but it wasn't the desired design that I wanted. I wanted designers to be embedded in delivery teams so we could build a better culture around product development. And that took time, but we eventually got there. And that helped us move away from the captain's calls, where the CEO would have a bright idea and it would just come down the chain so quickly, and suddenly it was a committed piece of work that then we had to take from being a 6-month piece of work down to maybe 2 months. And that was a little bit of the legacy that I inherited and worked really hard with the teams to move away from, and for us to evolve to something resembling a modern, tech firm or something like that. So that was some of the key before and afters. I'm sure I've missed a lot because it was a hectic 2 years, and this is all going on while we're doing broader retooling and replatforming, that we are re-instrumenting our data so we can have more real-time data where there's billions of events firing every week. Renegotiating contracts with studios so we can reduce our operational expenditure to somehow get towards profit. We're introducing ads and then trying to introduce more ad formats so we can have additional revenue streams. And we also moved away from being this upfront registration experience to being more like, I suppose, YouTube. You can come in and watch, and there are ads playing. So there's a substantial user experience hurdles that need to be navigated in parallel to, lacing up your boots and putting on jacket and tie and trying to look somewhat respectable. So with regards to just some closing points or closing thoughts, I've lost track of time. I hope we're doing okay. But throughout my career and obviously more recently with iflix, I see UX as the engine of change. There's often a lot of expectation with UX that they're going to come in and just do wireframes and maybe some personas and kind of do the UX. As my third point there. But when you are able to really engage with users and the business and understand the landscape and find some new opportunities and some insights that will be the initial wiggle on the long whip of change, if you know what I mean. It's just that little bit of change that then has this long tail and eventually a crack at the end. There's so much that came out of the design teams at iflix that would lead on to being some fairly significant change within the business, and they're to be commended for it. Good UX and bad UX are worlds apart. You know, I feel that we've oscillated between absolutely, I wouldn't even call it UX, and then doing something towards good UX at iflix. And sometimes that changes week to week. Just because we got the tooling right and we got the processes down doesn't mean that we would always adhere to it, because we went through some very difficult times financially where we had to lay off people, and we grew, then shrunk, then kind of grew, then shrunk again. And when you're losing people and IP, and you know, that just flies out the door, there's you're kind of almost in a continual norming phase of your team, and so you've got to be a little bit gentle on one another, I suppose, while we all try and do our best. And I think that it then is easy to fall into the trap of just doing the UX. And I think that was something that we would hold ourselves accountable for eventually, where we would say, yeah, this is just something I came up with. I haven't spoken to a user. I haven't, you know, done any customer competitive research on this, but I think this will do. And let's just take this to the next stage and see where it leads us. Because sometimes time is, you just don't have enough. So I think there's often times where there needs to be a bit of appreciation that, so long as you're moving in the right direction, you know, taking a step back here and there is okay, for the greater good of you know, flow, for sure. But I would say that, as I mentioned earlier, investing in good tools and processes like we did, we eventually got there, was absolutely crucial. So when I started, there was maybe 4 or 5 designers, and then hired another 3, and then we lost a few. But by the end, I think it was 2. I had just Thorpe and a designer in Malaysia called Nadira, and they were banging out some really great designs really quickly, because we had the foundation. We had the really good tools that allowed for fast and effective communication and collaboration globally. We had our user testing tools that we could spin something up and get it to, you know, the finance department in the Philippines, or you know, the marketers in KL really quickly. Let alone going out and getting users on the ground to test. So that was a real engine of efficiency and effectiveness that allowed us to scale more with fewer people. And if we didn't have that in place, then we wouldn't have been able to operate the way we did towards the end. Facing your experiential, technical, and data debt as soon as possible. I think this comes a bit of an underscoring of the turning towards your customer title of this little chat. Is it's easy to think you know what you're doing, and to think you know that because you've got users, you're solving user problems and you're giving user value. In these hyper-competitive markets, you're only, especially with streaming, you're only giving as much content versus the competitor. And with what streaming is, you know, the service isn't king, it's the content, if that makes sense. It's people come to Disney Plus for the classics. They don't go to Disney Plus necessarily just because it's Disney. The same with Netflix and Stan. If they didn't have, you know, the originals, they'd lose a license for Friends or The Office. People will follow those shows because there's loyalty to the show, not to the brand of the streaming company. So you then need to deliver a bulletproof service. You can't let your performance be seen. It just needs to run on rails, and it needs to be understandable and intuitive so people can just find what they're looking for. Because that was the key thing with our design. It was not that it looked beautiful, or that it had some really funky animations, or some really quirky kind of character to the design. It was that people could find what they wanted to watch as quickly as possible. We wanted the design to sit behind all of the posters of the content, and that means that we need to face our experiential debt, where there were dead ends, where there was glaring design flaws and inconsistencies, the technical debt, that we fixed our performance issues, reduced the load times, reduced the crash rates, and the data debt, that we actually knew what was happening within the app. Because for a long time there, it was a black hole, which you might think is surprising considering how many people we're serving, but it wasn't. It's not surprising, I should say. Understanding delivery and move through the system. Understanding what happens, why people debate certain parts of your design, and how design can go from, just small changes can take a design from being something that's achievable within the day to something that needs 6 months. And I find that's what is the understated, elegant beauty of design, is that you are constantly on that knife's edge of taking a design into a place that's incredibly expensive, or you can just make it very cheap and quick, and you can learn faster with your users. So you want to bring your engineers and developers into the conversation much sooner, and you want to bring curiosity, as you would expect that they bring curiosity as well. And then I think a little bit of what Yuan was saying earlier about research and design is knowing when to say when. When is enough to push to sit on the design before taking that out and learning. Ultimately, the market will be the tester, but it's also the most expensive place to test. So you want to do the right amount of testing before you start to code, but at the same time, you can spin wheels, user testing. But in the time it's taken you to do that and get to market, the market's already changed. And that was the scary landscape that we lived in, where the landscape of competitors and other elements within the market, telcos, massive competitors, you've got studios, all of these muscling in, trying to get more money and command more of the market share. You need to get more value out faster so you can build some semblance of loyalty. And our prime competitor was one of the primary competitors was piracy. So if people are willing to jump through all the hoops to pirate versus use a platform for free that has, thousands of hours of content on it, then you've got some pretty fundamental challenges there. And so we tried to spend just the right amount of time on designs and get it out and show our users that we were evolving, we were learning, and that we were fixing the basics. And that's my talk. So thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. That was fantastic. Great stuff. It was a great insight into seeing how iflix really worked and how you built it from the start up. And I also see there's a comment here from Torpe, and he's saying when you got can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh yeah, he says when you got rid of the subscription wall, it made a huge difference, particularly with SEO, as your title pages were now searchable.
Yeah. I thought he was going to be cheeky, but yes. So I can't see the question, so I'll just talk to that briefly. But we were throttling our penetration within our markets with the business model that was a subscription only, coupled with a registration first experience. Once we understood that subscriptions were not going to work, even though we were cheaper than Netflix and other competitors, and that users were bailing out at something like 80-90% on the first registration page, that we needed to make that open. Those two things alone saw us increase to 100%. I think we got up to around the 12 million mark after those changes. But one of the interesting changes we made was linking. This is probably one of the most intense design challenges at iflix. But we realized that the mass market were on pretty ordinary devices, and they weren't going to download a 30 megabyte app to then find something to watch. That wasn't the thought process. They were going to jump on Google or something like that and search for the title and find the quickest way to download it or the cheapest way to watch it. So we re-engineered, re-architected, completely redid our website to be open without registration and very lightweight. And it was using a specific technology that would only download that which is visible to you on your phone, if that makes sense. So it's not a heavy, from a data perspective, data footprint. So it was super speedy eventually, and would allow a user to search. And we would then do a lot of SEO work on that to drive a lot of traffic. And we launched that in November, and then between November 20th and December 20th, something like that, it was 5 million monthly active users. And so that became an engine of building trust. So that we wanted to use it to build trust with iflix, because who's iflix? Even though it sounds like we had a lot of users, we were still small compared to a lot of our competitors. So we wanted to build trust, look at all of these shows you can watch. We would allow you to watch some, but we would then start to communicate and introduce some friction at the right point of your web journey to move across to the app. And underscoring that was a very lightweight gamification, very, very lightweight, where we would use rewards to incentivize you through a freemium model to, you come in, you get 24 hours access on web to watch whatever you want. But then once that expires, hey, jump and download the app, you get 30 days. So it was about just inching you further towards the app, because we knew the app users were more engaged. Because by the very nature of you having downloaded an app, you're more invested than just visiting a website. So we wanted to increase the regularity of visits. So over a month period, that was our key metric from a viewership retention, I suppose. And then we wanted to increase the number of minutes that people watched, and ultimately the more ads consumed, and that was dollars. And that was our primary method of generating cash. And so it was a combination of removing the registration, introducing the free tier, and connecting different platforms, different experiences, which sounds easier than it was. They really moved the needle for us.
Thomas, thank you so much. We're just about out of time, so I won't be taking any more questions, but really thanks a million, and I'll send out your voucher to you as well. I really appreciate your presentation tonight, and I'll send everyone in the group here a link to the video from tonight. Before everyone goes, I was wondering if I could get a photo of the whole lot of us. If you could stop sharing your screen, Thomas, and I'll just get a view of everyone and perhaps we could get a photo of everyone in the group. If anyone would like to turn on their camera for a quick photo and give us a wave, maybe. Thank you, guys. Great stuff. Delighted. Just to let you know, next time we've got, so basically we're going to have another one of these meetups in around 6 to 8 weeks. Hopefully it might be in the Whisper offices, but we'll see what the situation is with COVID. I've been in talks with a whole load of really interesting people, so hopefully we get a few of those. Just to name drop a few, I can see Mark Van Dam is here tonight. Mark said he will present in the future. He's from A Cloud Guru, he's product manager. I also see Jean is here, Jean Gao. He's a tech lead at Australia Post. David Vu, the head of UX and design at Livehire, said he will present in the future. Also, Matt Milosevic, he's the CEO and co-founder of Usability Hub. I see he's here tonight as well. Shadi Zandi, she's the development lead at MYOB. She was here earlier, she had to leave. And Kirsten Mann is also in the lineup for the future. So yeah, stay tuned, and thank you so much for coming tonight. And once again, a big, massive round of applause, and thank you to our presenters. That's Tom and Yuan. Thank you, guys.
You're welcome.
Thanks for coming. See you again. Bye.